With the signing of the legislation creating Glacier National Park in 1910, Louis Hill finally had the jewel he coveted, a national park served only by his railroad, one to compete with the Northern Pacific's highly successful partnership with Yellowstone National Park and the Southern Pacific's national monument, the Grand Canyon. With the creation of Glacier National Park, and with his political and logistical problems seemingly solved, only one significant problem remained. Congress had only appropriated $50,000 for the startup of Glacier National Park. In the years to follow, annual budgets were but a fraction of that. Yet, in order to be successful in his vision, Louis Hill needed accommodations for the visitors his railroad would deliver. Ever the entrepreneur, and with an Interior Department policy that virtually made the Glacier National Park an operating division of the Great Northern Railroad in these early years, Hill set about to remedy his problem. Louis Hill wanted to create accommodations appealing to his Eastern passengers, who had heard about this Western wonderland in numerous publications. There was an Eastern curiosity about these Western wild places, and Hill's marketing department did its best to lure people who had previously traveled to Europe to change their ways and, as Hill's advertisements put it, see America first. And that, of course, meant his America, Glacier National Park, which Hill's pitchmen had dubbed the Alps of America. A fan of Swiss architecture and realizing his clientele often picked Switzerland as a destination resort, his taste and his projected demand led him to design and build hotels with a distinctive Swiss architectural feel. Ultimately, all three of Hill's hotels in the park would share the same basic theme. Hill's first hotel was to be at the railroad stop then known as Midvale, located on the eastern side of what Congress had mapped as the park's boundaries. It would later be named variously Glacier Park Lodge and then East Glacier, and it was on the edge of Montana's prairies, but in close sight of the mountains on Glacier's Rocky Mountain eastern front. In 1910, when the park was created, Hill was at a lumber exposition in Portland, Oregon, where the main exposition hall used huge timbers to create the needed large convention hall space. The idea so intrigued him that he had his architects design a similar structure for the main building of his first hotel complex, a design that he would emulate in his other Glacier Park hotels as well. But practical problems surfaced. No trees of the size needed for Hill's envisioned design existed in the Montana forest near Glacier, and in which the Interior Department had granted him full use of for his needed timber to build his hotels. But Hill had an advantage that few builders had. He owned a railroad. So the timbers that he needed were cut and transported from the western coasts of Washington and Oregon to the hotel building site at Midvale. In 1913, Hill's Glacier Park Lodge opened for its first tourist season. Hill, ever the business pitchman, ballyhooed the park as a destination resort for America. Some 12,000 tourists heeded his call that year. The business of Glacier National Park had officially begun. Hill had made extensive use of the Indian presence in the park in his promotional materials, and he made sure that they were there at the railroad station when each train arrived, twice a day, to greet the Eastern visitor. Eastern visitors entered the hotel and were greeted by the large timbers that Hill had imported from the Pacific coast. By today's standards, it may not seem like much, but by the standards of the day, it was really something. The guests even enjoyed campfires within the hotel in uniquely designed campfire pits located within the center of the visiting areas in the hotel. He even had a golf course. Although it was made to appear much larger than it really was, it hardly is a par 3 course by today's standards. Nevertheless, the Eastern visitors were intrigued by the notion of golf with Indians looking on. The golf course still exists today, 95 years later, after the hotel's initial construction. And by today's standards, it is in fact recognized as a fairly short par 3 course. Nevertheless, the golf course and the flowers are much as they were 95 years ago when they were originally designed by Louis Hill himself. The buildings still retain the majesty of their original construction, though the roofs have now been replaced with steel. The Indian presence is still there, with numerous teepees located about the premises, but the Indians no longer greet the Amtrak trains as they arrive. The building itself has been well maintained. The flowers are still the same types of flowers that Louis Hill personally picked out for the flower baskets in the gardens back in 1915. The interior of the hotel is still the same majestic timbers as it was back then, and they still are just as beautiful as they were to the first park visitors in 1913. The interior lobby may have changed somewhat over the years, but the general flavor that Louis Hill was trying to convey to his Eastern clientele is still very evident. The lobby walls have beautiful paintings of various areas of the park, and the grandeur of Hill's very first hotel is still evident today. Hill would go on following this to build the Mini Glacier Lodge, a very similar and slightly smaller hotel than the one in East Glacier, and ultimately purchase a hotel in West Glacier, which he would redesign and revamp into what would be called the Lake McDonald Lodge.